Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last in this series of FinGeo online virtual seminars. And we're very happy to have Andrew Leyshon. We asked him for the first series already of these online seminars. And then I'm not sure why, but it was delayed. So that's not a problem at all. We're happy to have him now as the last one of this calendar year. I was surprised also in Andrew's CV that he sent, that you've probably all seen online, that he's now an emeritus professor. I think the years must have been going faster than I realized, and maybe Andrew also realized. So he's an emeritus professor of economic geography at the University of Nottingham and academic partner coordinator at the Midlands Engine. His research has focused mainly on money and finance and the music industry and the emergence of diverse economies, and he's the author and editor of numerous books that reflect these interests. In the CV online, you can read more, but I don't want to make it too long. So I'm going to give the floor to Andrew. And Andrew, you have about half an hour, so till 4:35 in your case. And then we'll have 25 minutes for Q&A.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah,
okay.
Looks perfect.
Okay, well, thanks, Stefan, for the introduction, and to Karen for the original invitation. This is rather later than it should have been, so apologies for that. Kind of various reasons, things have been going on this year and so on. So what I'm going to talk about today is some work that is the latest kind of collaborative work that I've been doing with Paul Langley, who's pictured there and who should be on the call, if not now, soon. And I was speaking of earlier. He's very pleased that I've got a younger version of him on this screen, but he is my younger, much better looking co-author. So there is that. And this is the work that we've done to date, and this presentation is hopefully the fifth paper in this series, and it's been going on for quite a while, actually. But this is and some of you, I apologise, will have seen earlier versions of this, but this has moved on, and we are looking for further suggestions how this could be improved. So we welcome comments. So this is the structure of the paper. And what the paper is going to do is outline the ways in which sovereign regulatory agencies are responding to the challenge of FinTech's novel platform ecologies. So for some Western regulators, FinTech has seemingly magical, if not fairy tale-like qualities as a form of economic organization that will assist them in their task of ensuring that financial markets are neither too hot nor too cold. In other words, finance and the rest of the economy can benefit from the efficiency and effectiveness of financial markets, but without all the unpleasant costs and misery caused by periodic and catastrophic market failures. And the centrality of data to platform finance business models offers up hope that these platforms may be better suited to providing consistent, up-to-date, and even real-time data in line with regulatory requirements. So from that perspective, platform finance or FinTech may be better able to ensure the systems are born regulatory compliant, and by being so and being inherently data focused, to be much more readily adaptable to changing market and regulatory requirements. Now, this is a laudable aim, but regulators hope that the financial institutions will be able to live happily ever after, maybe somewhat optimistic. So what we suggest is the messy geographical and political realities of the world's emerging platform financial ecologies, and the imperative of competition within global finance means that FinTech will be a much more unruly problem object than many financial regulators hope and anticipate. So the arguments developed by drawing on two case studies. The first is the UK, where FinTech has been celebrated by various regulators and financial elites on the potential to be just right. And second, China, where regulatory authorities, after initial encouragement, have taken a more critical and far more instrumental view of platforms and FinTech and the ecologies they engender, and they have been setting out limits to their powers and actions. So financial regulation is one of the most important forms of market intervention that states undertake. A failure of money and finance has potentially catastrophic impacts on all aspects of economic and social life. So when the everyday flow of money and finance is disrupted or halted, where payments and receipts become uncertain, there's a need to recalculate the taken for granted returns on savings and investments, the likely costs of loans and other deficits, and the simple availability of capital for further investment. The politician that was charged with responsibility for the UK economy during the 2008 financial crisis made it clear that the scale of intervention that he authorized as the crisis broke down was shaped by his stark recognition that if the financial system broke down, then so would just about everything else. In his memoir, Alistair Darling, Chancellor of the Exchequer between 2007 and 2010, recalls being called out of a European finance minister meeting on October the 7th, 2008 to deal with an emerging crisis at the UK bank RBS, which is in danger of failing within a matter of hours. There's a quote there in a journalist article when his book came out. There's just the italics bit there, people without money can do nothing. And that kind of helps stress the importance of making sure that you regulate money appropriately. This kind of risk, a catastrophic undermining of the monetary basis of the economy, is one of the reasons traditionally identified for the existence of financial regulation. So this ensuring financial stability is a key plank of regulation to prevent this broader systemic economic collapse. And this control includes control of the monetary form itself, coins and notes, but for the most part involves regulating the behaviors and actions of the institutions and firms that perform financial intermediation functions. So alongside financial stability, you've got 6 other concerns there, which is safeguarding financial investors, safeguarding customers, encouraging market efficiency and then competition, and also preventing malfeasance and crime. So these are the 6 main factors that are taken into account when designing financial regulation. But finance is a very challenging policy object. And there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, the long-term nature of many financial products means there's often a gap between events and consequences. So you can make changes and it seems to be going very well, but things are going along in the background unnoticed for quite a long time. And by the time you've noticed, it's kind of too late. You have the process of financial innovation itself. There's great description by the Manchester Crest team, a reference here to Ismail Erturk's et al., where they use the term bricolage, where innovation, you get structures from events. So new financial instruments and practices are developed from the existing regulatory structure. So as soon as you put something in place, there's a kind of movement to see if you can move beyond that through developing new financial instruments that goes beyond the regulatory view and purview. And in addition to that, you also have regulatory arbitrage and race to the bottom. So as well as moving into other areas, states and regulatory bodies respond to this. And they may actually think that this innovation, this movement beyond regulation is something that they can then come to terms with. And they may see the concentration and accumulation of financial services as a competitive economic asset, actively encourage light touch regulatory regimes and focus on promoting competition and market efficiency, setting aside negative concerns about stability or malfeasance on the grounds that after periods of relative stability, in a quote from one of Ewald Engelin's lead papers in that team, that everything was probably all right. And therefore, you know, you can kind of relax about it. I'm sure these financial institutions know what they're doing. So how to trade off this balance between risk and reward through regulation? Legal scholar Christy Ford identifies this chronic problem in that states and regulators want to strike a balance between permissiveness and innovation on the one hand, while also seeking to avoid the catastrophic consequences of out of control finance on the other. And we're still, in many parts of the world, living with the consequences of a failure to regulate financial services appropriately in the 1990s and 2000s. Just look at the problems of austerity and running down of public services, including health services, which have been made all too clear in the last 18 months or so. So we're going to focus on 2 case studies of regulation, which have sought to use FinTech to achieve other goals and reflect distinctive financial ontologies and understandings about the role of regulation in relation to FinTech. I'm going to start with the UK. So, if only the tricky nature of financial regulation could somehow be made easier and more tractable, and many believe that it can be, again, great work from the Manchester Crest team, and they work on hubristic elites, illustrate that elites, regulators think, well, yeah, they got it wrong this time, but they just need to work harder, they just need to be smarter, and then next time it really can be different. But there's a strong possibility, this is the latest in a line of neoliberal fairy tales told about the financial system. So Mary Mellor, in a book that came out about 3 years ago, Money, Myths, Truth and Alternatives, has got a whole series of neoliberal fairy tales that run through understandings of the financial system, through notions of barter, the role of gold, what banks do, and so on. And we can apply the Goldilocks principle to finance as a regulatory object. And that is, I'm sure I don't need to rehearse what that is. So the problem is if it's too hot, if the financial system is too hot, you get rapid economic growth, but you get financial instability with a crash and crisis not too far away. If it's too cold, you get a stable financial system, but you get credit gaps and financial exclusions. But what you want is it just right. You want an efficient allocation of credit, financial inclusion, economic growth, but without overheating. Now, how do you achieve this? Well, the UK state, quite early on, began to see platforms as a way of delivering this form of regulation. It's a strong supporter of platform as an economic actor in delivering the best of all possible worlds. And there's some great quote in Brett Christopher's Rentier Capitalism, where he talks about the way in which the UK government, in response to EU publication consultation on digital platforms, which was kind of critical, came back quite strongly by saying, well, actually, digital platforms might themselves serve as quasi-regulatory force in the economy more broadly. They could do the work of regulators and somehow do it better. I think the somehow is carrying a lot of weight in that one. And in a direct quotation from the report, through networks, platforms are offering answers to many of the challenges which previously looked to regulation to tackle. And this support for FinTech has been quite broad amongst various financial and regulatory elites in the UK as a solution to this too hot, too cold problem of financial markets. And one of the reasons is it can be seen as a way of materializing behavioral economics and the beliefs of behavioral economics. FinTech, through the design of its apps, might nudge both less than rational buyers and sellers towards more financially sustainable outcomes. So FinTech has strong regulatory appeal because it's potentially compliant ready through the integral nature of software and algorithms. FinTech firms exist as potential disruptive competitors to the too big to fail banks, which have seemed to be a problem in the last crisis. And through being accessible and being relatively cheap at the point of use, they can promote financial inclusion, as has been promoted and practiced in the global south for 15 years or so now. And this turn to FinTech has been endorsed by a UK government-sponsored report on the sector, the Khalifa Review of UK Finance, which is led by a former CEO of WorldPay, a leading firm in this area. And the report argues enthusiastically for more regulatory engagement to ensure that the UK emerges as a leading space for FinTech. This is strongly supported by commentators such as the Financial Times, who argue that something like a digital big bang would be a way the UK overcoming the financial services disaster. There's been Brexit, and the work of Sarah Hall and Martin Hennigan has been doing a great job in exposing just the problems that are emerging through the failure to negotiate equivalent access and equivalences in EU markets. So this might be a way round it. And it's interesting that kind of the first thing they emphasize really in this recommendation is about policy and regulation. Let's just get the policy and regulation right, and then we can establish this as a competitive sector to move to the next stage of global UK. In that policy and regulation suggestion, they mentioned a thing called a scale box, which supports firms in scaling innovative technology, which has been a classic problem in UK business generally. And this idea of a scale box alludes to the success of the UK in promoting the regulatory sandbox, which is a way for fintech firms to test new business models in a safe environment using specially selected customers. The idea is drawn from computer science, where a sandbox is a closed testing environment designed for experimenting safely with web or software products. So the purpose is to adapt compliance with financial regulation that doesn't kill the innovation, while ensuring, I suppose, doesn't kill the consumers either, and therefore become a disaster. So it's all kind of controlled. It gives new and potentially radical financial products a chance to make their case and for bugs and risks to be spotted and tested and fixed. And the purpose of the sandpit is to create what's described as contestable verticals, an awful term, but that's markets in which firms can compete while being regulator compliant and safe and deliver benefits to consumers. In one sense, you might think about it, well, what's not to like, really? If you can kind of design it all out and it's, you know, you can test it and it can work. And it's certainly an idea that's escaped its author. A World Bank report from last year reported there's been now 73 different sandboxes in 57 countries. Most developed, if you look at the yellow shading there, so the UK is the origin of this, but it's used extensively in form of sandboxes, innovation hubs and reg tech labs in the UK, Australia, the US and Japan. But you can see that it's got global purchase in various forms. However, work is beginning to emerge on sandboxes, which suggests they may not be as safe as they claim. There's the recent paper by Brown and Poroska. And it's an interesting paper as well, because they kind of have to do it through secondary sources. They've got a kind of rather plaintive comment in there that they did approach lots of regulatory authorities and sandbox organizers for information, but response they got none, which is quite interesting. So they argue that sandboxes constitute risk washing. Is that financial regulatory institutions making products or processes of a company seem to involve less risk for stakeholders by engaging in activities that mimic in a superficial or narrow way genuine attempts to assess and reduce risk. So they argue that it's really dressing up the reduction of risk rather than reducing risk. Okay, let's move now to the second case study where fintech or platform finance has been strongly promoted. So the Chinese state is also an enthusiastic promoter of platform finance, and Julian Gruen's work has been especially helpful here. And he asked the key question: why would the Chinese Communist Party support fintech if it was seen to be disruptive and challenging? Why would it engage in this kind of unruly form of capitalism? And he argues this for a number of reasons. First of all, the disruption is helpful in as much as it shifts power away from large commercial banks, the large Chinese commercial banks, and facilitates middle-class consumption and economic growth, arguing that the large commercial banks are too powerful, that they're too resistant to change, and it's very difficult to get them to move the economy in the way that the party wants. Secondly, it promotes financial exclusion and closes credit gaps to the kind of unserved part of the market. And also, thirdly, Chinese fintechs have produced financial credit rating measures that have been extended to other areas, such as a social credit rating system. So fintech in China really is platform finance. It's the financial arms of already established platforms, mainly Alipay and Tencent. So growth here shares similarities with the promotion of platform finance in the global south. That is the ability to use new kinds of data, almost proxy data, to construct trust to facilitate lending to previously excluded populations. And the Chinese state has actively encouraged the growth of these large platform finance firms, or at least they did. So Ant Financial emerged out of Alibaba, which was a general sales platform along the lines of eBay. And the Chinese platform finance firms, for their part, saw an opportunity to work with financial regulators and government to displace the market power of the big banks while building Communist Party support and market position. But ultimately, these firms were under the control of the Chinese state, which sees the firms as a way of delivering development goals that the traditional financial system was holding up because of its efficiencies and unresponsiveness and kind of embedded power. But as Gruen presently pointed out in the quote on the screen at the bottom, As a non-bank, non-state owned institution in China, Ant Finance is not allowed to independently grow too big to manage. And this, of when it did seem to be getting too big to manage, was about just over a year ago. The limits to the power of platform finance was revealed with the wings of platforms starting to be clipped. And this was part of recognition of much of this growth took place in an environment of weak regulation, so part of the liability was on the state, but that has called both of the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese platform firms. So the planned IPO of Ant Group, which is going to be the largest in the world, was pulled in October 2020 after the CEO, Jack Ma, made a widely publicized criticism of financial regulation, both at an international and a national level. So he kind of wasn't holding back on his criticism. As a result of this, the thing was pulled, and subsequent reports came out that Xi personally made sure that this happened. And some of the major issues referred to in the Financial Times report on the left there is the amount of highly leveraged lending that has been undertaken by Financial to support its growth. So again, it was taking place in almost unregulated financial environments in large parts of China. And when people started looking into this, if this lending had failed, it would have had little or no consequences for Ant, given it was it put hardly any capital behind these loans whatsoever. But it would have wider consequences for those taking out the loans and for those places where the debtors were based. And China had already been burned by serial failures in its crowdfunding sector over the last 5 years or so. So we were kind of keen to avoid this spreading even further. And so what we've seen is this tightening down first on fintech firms. So this is kind of broadened to tech firms generally. And the consequences of this decision are still working their way through. And with a new attention to the regulation of platform finance in the pipeline for 2020, which would mean platform firms have to make new capital adequacy requirements to cover bad loans, making them more like traditional banks. So there's measures to reduce leverage. They would have to cover 30% of all loans compared to the 2% that Ant were previously offering for their microloans, a forced sharing of credit data in a central database, and a stronger state role in the regulation of fintech, and encouraging banks into regulatory sandboxes that would test financial products, which would involve the large state banks. So bringing them in to kind of link them to these more established organizations. So the overt aim of coupling fintech to established finance. So I think I'm doing okay for time. So I'll come to the concluding remarks. So often financial regulation is often thought of as being restrictive, and that's the way in which people see it. That's how financial institutions certainly traditionally depict financial regulation, with tropes about red tape getting in the way, etc. But financial regulation is it's a technical intervention in a critically important sector that seeks to maintain a balance between a number of interests and stakeholders, between financial capital, between the economy in general, civil society, and governance. Regulatory context helps shape the emergence of different kinds of platform firms and different kinds of platform ecologies, which could be seen as reflective of different understandings of the way in which the financial economy works and what it's for. In the UK, the regulation of fintech offers up hope of a kind of automated regulation, a kind of de ex machina. If one can set the ground rules and ensure the products and services are risk tested beforehand, then fintech can be released into the world compliant with the 6 main goals of financial regulation. In China, fintech is also being used to deliver political ambitions for the economy, but certainly in a less rose-tinted manner. And this is important because, at least in the context of the UK, a debate is underway about the purpose of financial regulation in the face of changes after Brexit, and complaints from the financial services sector that the 2012 Financial Services Act removed the requirement of the financial regulator to, quote, have regard close quote, to the desirability of maintaining the competitive position of the United Kingdom when making and enforcing regulations. That prior focus on competition was seen to be in part responsible for encouraging the conditions that reveal structural weaknesses in UK institutions in the crisis. And some of us remember in the 2000s of this competition between London and New York about how the kind of relative regulation could be changed to encourage capital to move from one city to the other, where again, gaming the regulatory authorities. Now, there are pressures mounting in parts of the UK financial services sector to reintroduce the competitive clause, to have regard for the competitiveness of UK financial services, which has come at the same time as the review of the financial regulatory framework in the UK and the chance of the Exchequer's call for a Big Bang 2.0. So while regulators are currently nominally against the reintroduction of a competitive clause, I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and the likelihood is that it will be a secondary clause. It'll be there, but not primary. The thing is that regulators serve the political priorities of whatever the current framework is, and that can easily change. And part of the problem here is that in the UK rather, competition is often been seen as the end point. It's the orthodox economist viewpoint. If one delivers efficiency, then the outcomes will look after themselves. Whereas any cursory historical view of the economy will reveal, lots of competition does not necessarily lead to good outcomes. The Chinese Communist Party, which, if nothing else, has a pretty well-established long-run view and understanding of history, takes a far more instrumental means justifies the end view of FinTech, as Johannes Petri has argued in relation to its financial system more generally. So it may well be on a global scale, FinTech has become something of a chaotic conception, where surface similarities match some fundamental differences in their structural foundations, which revolve around their regulation, design, and purpose. And there you are, I've come in on time, so I invite questions.
Thank you very much, Andy. Also for sticking to the time, even better than expected. This was just 25 minutes, that's great. So we still have half an hour for Q&A or people who want to debate things rather than asking a question. I hope my camera should be on. I hope people can see me. My connection is a little slow, so I hope it works. Darek Wojcik, I see, has the first question.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you for a great presentation, Andrew. I was hoping I wouldn't be the first to ask a question, but yeah, I'm happy to ask. So with what you finished on the kind of Chinese approach to FinTech and the British approach and how it's a tool of international competitiveness in the UK, it's presented this way. And in China, it doesn't seem to be the main concern, despite the tradition of a national champion policy in China. So you might ask, why doesn't China want a FinTech national champion that is successful internationally? Is it just so other authorities so clever that they prioritize financial stability and development ahead of a successful national champion? And it's also part of my comment relates to the role of the city of Hangzhou and its government, because I've also read that there's been this attack on financial, if we can call it this way, by the central government is combined with a clampdown on local corruption in Hangzhou, and it's a kind of a warning to the city. Because very much, Alibaba, the whole group and its success has been kind of inseparable from the success of Hangzhou as a city, as a financial center of the last decade. So I'm not asking here a clear question. I listening to myself, but I was just wondering what kind of what could be the going beyond this kind of. Yeah, we are impressed by the, if you like, the kind of priorities of the Chinese central government, which seem to make more sense for many reasons than the priorities of the British government. But is there much more behind it in China potentially that explains the situation rather than a very rational a rational kind of policy priority. So that's my comment on the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I guess in one sense, context is all, isn't it? So so one criticism is, well, China and the UK are very different, clearly, but that is certainly true. But that shows why the Chinese state can be more relaxed about not pushing the competitiveness at all costs, and it does take a kind of longer run view of these things. So it doesn't want to push this at the cost of other things. Whereas in the context of the UK, I suppose things are slightly a little more desperate, and perhaps we can come back to that. But the other thing, I guess, in China is that nothing can become more important than the Chinese Communist Party, I suppose, and so that it has to make sure that they are preeminent at all times. And I guess they have wider considerations as well. Paul and I were talking earlier about the way in which the Chinese state is also, you mentioned about that kind of crackdown on Hangzhou, but also about tech generally, about apps and addictiveness and engagement, and having a kind of much more paternalistic social concern about what the consequences of this kind of economic growth is having elsewhere. And that could be kind of social, psychological, but it's also political as well. So it's kind of, it has more time, it has more scope, precisely because of its dominant position. And you can see the way in which, I put a couple of things in the slide there, the way in which they're forcing some tech firms to withdraw from international capital markets. So like DD is withdrawing from New York, other firms as well. So they kind of exerting more control over these companies much more generally. So in a sense, they have a more controlled view, I guess, of where they want things to go, rather than pushing competition for the sake of it.
Thank you, Andrew and Derek. I see there's a question from Jing Shu in the chat box. Jing, are you able to ask the question yourself? If not, I will invite Andrew to read it, but it would be nice to have a bit of interaction.
I didn't even have that open. Let's have that.
Jing, are you there?
Oh, right.
Okay, probably the mic, you're saying.
So is this the thing about the Bahamas?
No, if you go from the bottom to the top, might be the easiest.
Right. How do you perceive the disruption, innovation, FinTech, and regulation to make it just right? To be more detailed, the disruption, innovation are helping with breaking down the hierarchy. It's trying to make FinTech banking more analogous to traditional banking, which is hierarchy and high cost. Yes, well, I guess so I suppose it may have already done its job in one sense with the traditional banks by kind of unsettling them to some extent, and then bringing them to kind of work with FinTech, so much as the way in which there's often been a kind of dichotomy presented between FinTech disruptors and traditional banks, but actually, these organizations are working together and developing kind of joint ventures quite extensively. So I guess, yes, this would be a way of getting the best out of both worlds, really, of getting the innovation, the dynamism of some of these platform finance firms in China, but then linking them to state banks and all their kind of tradition of working within finance.
Thank you. Then there's a question by Karen.
Manuel, I'm trying to think. I kind of have two separate thoughts going on in my head. Am I allowed to, or should I pick one?
You can go for both as far as I want. And if Andrew wants, you can just pick one, right?
Okay, fair enough. I mean, the one I had at the back of my head towards the end of your presentation, Andrew, talking about regulators, right? And what are the role of regulators? But I guess by the end of the presentation, I wanted to have a bit more depth or details about what is it that regulators do. And when you started bringing in, how do we frame the UK regulatory stance or response, vis-a-vis what the Chinese regulators seem to prioritize, but there are also other finer grains in between, right? So in my case, I obviously think about what Singapore regulator does, right, in their approach to FinTech, And some of the, when you were talking about the regulatory sandbox and so on, for example, that's something that's been around, in Singapore for FinTech for many years earlier than in the UK. But at the same time, the objective was never just purely about competition as an end goal, because there's a very overtly promotional aspect to regulation, which is not something that we always find, right, in terms of the regulatory approach, in the UK and also in the US, where it's a bit more distant, instead of that very overtly promotional angle, which you find some of that in the production of the national champions, right, that Derek talks about in the Chinese case. So I'm just wondering if you could, talk a little bit more about some of the variations or finer grained approach to thinking of what do regulators do in these kinds of contexts. That was kind of my first question. Maybe I should leave it there for now, and if you want to respond to that instead of mentioning.
Well, it's a great question, and of which I'm not sure I have a great answer. But I guess there's a range of different views of what they should do, because precisely they are trying to balance a whole set of interests. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's from kind of stability, preventing crime, preventing malfeasance, but while also trying to get efficiency and for everybody, all the stakeholders, to feel they're getting a fair crack of the whip in the system. But it is very difficult to do. And I was at a meeting the other day, and somebody was saying just part of the solution to regulation is just to write more rules, and therefore you end up with kind of ridiculously long guidebooks, rule books of what you can do, but that's not necessarily the way to do it. So that's why you can see the appeal of things such as FinTech and RegTech, because you can build it in at the start, rather than write something and then hope that people will, through their practices, will conform. If you can somehow design it through the software, then in a sense they can do things. And then you can also, with the data, you can kind of check it more accurately as well. But certainly from the meetings I've been in with people who are regulators, ex-regulators, they have a range of different views on this. Some that they see 2008 as their touch point and they don't want to go back to that, and others then see the declining competitiveness of the UK as a disaster, and things need to be relaxed. We're so far away from that financial crisis, we should open it up. And that's the point that Christy Ford makes about this kind of dance between one thing and another. You kind of open things up, things seem to be going fine, but because of the temporal lag in what happens in financial markets, these problems are all building up, and then you have a crisis, and then everything works out, well, what do we do to try and prevent this? So you get a kind of a re-regulation and a tightening, and then until people say, well, this is, we're now losing out, we have to kind of open up again. And on top of this, you then get the economic geography of this, where you get different financial centers, different regimes in relation to others, and whether they feel they're kind of losing out through regulatory arbitrage.
I guess something else I was thinking of is that it's not only about regulators responding to contemporary or recent, right, events or competition or processes. It's also about the ideological baggage, that all of these regulators are situated in, and that's really important in explaining and situating their responses, and which is something that I guess it's kind of in there from what you were saying, but wasn't very obvious.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good point.
Can I briefly respond? I'm not.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah. I guess I think there's a danger that we kind of take regulation sort of narrowly as necessarily being about law and about juridical power. So one of the things that kind of struck me in looking in particularly to UK regulation was I came across this attempt to promote a British standard for FinTech platforms, and kind of puzzled over this for a while. And the whole idea of this was that, they could produce a standard by which startups could largely conform, that this would make it more easy further down the line for that startup to be purchased or to merge or to work in partnership, with bigger institutions. And so sometimes regulation here is juridical, sometimes it takes the form of other practices. I guess kind of the only broader reflection I would have is that, you know, if we were having this conversation in the late 80s, early 1990s, as Andrew would be more aware than I am. Thanks for that young picture, by the way, Andrew, it's much appreciated. Is that we would be talking about regulation as a concept, likely in the context of debates about regulation theory, where we would be seeing, you know, different regulatory regimes as part of different forms of capitalism. So there is another way of kind of reading our argument in those terms, I guess.
Thanks, Paul. There's another question from David Bussens in the chat. David informed me that he cannot ask the question as he's preparing chicken and applesauce. But David writes in the chat, to what extent is financial regulation also increasingly data regulation, meaning that regulatory competition is located beyond financial regulation proper?
Yeah, just to update, the chicken is almost ready. So,
nice, nice.
Well read.
So, David, do you want to elaborate on that? You mean just general?
Yeah, the thing is, I mean, yeah, it's just more of a conceptual question, because I think a lot of regulation that affects finance is not per se financial regulation, but deals with how do you regulate data, privacy rules, portability, but also deals when you look at, for instance, the European Union, their initiatives, competition law, and these kind of things, which as finance starts to coalesce with other sectors may also have an impact. But it's just more of a conceptual question of where really is financial regulation located if it's not only in financial regulation. It's a bit of a loop reasoning, but still.
Well, I guess, yeah, so I suppose that is what counts as a financial institution to some extent. And, you know, one of the arguments about FinTech has been that the reason for those successes is that, well, they're just shadow banks, really, so that they perform functions as if they are a bank, but they manage to operate out with of existing financial regulation. So that gives them certain competitive advantages. Paul and I have argued that really these FinTech firms, the distinctive thing about them is that they are platforms, but that doesn't mean that some of them are not shadow banks at the same time, that they are able to exercise some freedom by being outside of existing regulation. And there's some interesting work in the States about this in terms of predatory financing through certain kinds of apps and so on, because they're using data in a way that they have freedom because they're not subject to traditional financial regulation. But yeah, the importance of EU law is certainly not lost on UK financial institutions at the moment, but the failure to negotiate a whole series of equivalencies means that it's kind of like hemorrhaging markets at the moment.
Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Andy, again. I don't see any other questions in the chat so far, but if there's anyone who still wants to ask a question,
Chris,
and maybe you're not
Chris is
chat,
waving his hand.
Sorry, who's waving his hand?
Chris.
I have a question.
Chris, go ahead, Chris.
I'm wondering about neoliberalism. And so I guess my basic question is, what neoliberalism or why neoliberalism? Your title kind of suggests this fairy tale, which kind of implies it's this almost simplistic, childlike idea. But what is that idea? Because a lot of the things we've been talking about now for the last, in the Q&A have been about actually how complicated it is to get it just right. And what is it that they're trying to get right? I mean, I understand the balancing these different interests and different goals of finance in the economy, but I guess that's my question is, why is it neoliberal?
Well, in very simplistic terms, because that, in a sense, that the allocation is through the market. But as lots of work has shown that you need to do a lot of heavy lifting to try and get that to happen. So I suppose that, and it's also then that belief that if you can kind of do all that sort of setting up, then those market allocations will happen in an appropriate way that benefits efficiency and effectiveness. So I guess it's that, in a sense, so that it's the point of, you get to the point of letting it go, I suppose. So you set it up to let it go, and then you'll benefit from those outcomes through the play of market forces. So in a kind of rather crude way, we've set it up against China, where it's clearly not that. it's much more instrumental. There's a kind of clear goal, and the ability to intervene quite strongly is there.
You want to respond to this, Chris?
No.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks.
You look less than convinced. So
there's another question from. Okay, there's another question from Karen.
Yeah, it's my other question there that I thought, okay, maybe I can, kind of, it's more of a comment that came up when Derek was mentioning about Hangzhou and so on. And it made me think that if you think about the regulatory approach or concerns, in your case, contrasting kind of UK regulators and Chinese regulators, I think there's also a very strong regional financial center dimension on the China side that is not present in how the UK regulators look at fintech. Especially if you think about Hangzhou, for instance, right? There's direct implications for how Shanghai connects to Hangzhou or tries to mobilize its proximity to Hangzhou as a broader financial and fintech range of services. Similarly, Beijing obviously has its own objectives in that realm for finance and fintech, and then Shenzhen and the Greater Bay Area with Hong Kong has its own thing going too. And we see that very strongly at the recent kind of Hong Kong FinTech Week. So that just something that was making me think about that regional dimension and that financial centers dimension, on the Chinese regulatory concerns, whether it is something that they are concerned about in terms of how the regulatory moves, right, have the impact of either shifting or balancing, right, the opportunities and challenges of different regions and different centers in a way that doesn't show up on the UK side for all the other talks about leveling up and so on.
Yeah. Although actually interesting, in the Khalifa report, they do try and argue that it's not just London, that there are fintech centers outside, but we
don't see evidence of that in.
Well, no, and I would, if you want to have an exercise for your students about, how not to draw a regional geography of finance, have a look at it. It's just quite extraordinary how they try and group, they've obviously informed by this sort of leveling up agenda. So they've been told to go and look for fintech centers outside of London, but you just can't find it. So they kind of aggregate places that are not really, one is not like the other. Because it just isn't the critical mass outside of London really to justify it, despite what various cities say in terms of that they have fintech centres. They're very, very small compared to London.
Thank you again, Karen. Then there's one more question from Derek.
But Kate also has a hand up. I'm just wondering.
Oh, I didn't realize it. Thanks.
Hi, I joined the conversation a bit late, so I might have missed this, but I wonder if you talked about privacy and how certain platforms are monetizing or commercializing data privacy, especially within the fintech space.
No, I didn't, but it's an interesting point of view, and it is an interesting question. I don't know whether that may have kind of come into play with some of the Chinese reactions, but I don't know enough about that in the context of the UK, whether you would have thought that would have been covered by the kind of extant regulation as it is for financial service firms going into it. But no, that's an interesting question that we didn't think about.
And I also think that there's been some responses from, let's say, the non-private sector that wants to ensure more freedom and privacy and things like that. But then there's the private sector response, which wants to protect privacy by, commercializing it, if that makes sense, creating these data banks almost for individuals that they can then sell. And I was just wondering, I was just wondering what the future of that is. I mean, which side will win, so to speak.
Well, I do know that part of the crackdown, the recent crackdown in China, that data privacy was part of it, that they thought that there wasn't enough attention to that, which is interesting.
Thanks.
My connection is breaking up a little bit, so I think the question and answer was done, but I couldn't follow it myself very well. But if indeed this is the case, then let's move on to Tarek's question.
If I may, Andrew, I wanted to go back to what you mentioned about FinTech as regulation, platforms as regulation, seem to engage well with and respond well to some concerns and teachings of behavioral economics. If you could elaborate on this point, I found it very interesting and intriguing.
Well, I guess because you can, it's the way in which you can put advice effectively in the apps. So one of the, so this is not to say they're necessarily bad. So for example, there are some apps that when you make certain kinds of purchases, that if you have change, you can set it up so it'll automatically go into a savings account, right? So it attempts to nudge and encourage good behavior. It might help you make decisions, financial decisions, which are seen to be, really problematic or difficult. Well, some of the stuff that you've been doing, Derek, the stuff about index funds and so on, right? So that's a kind of good indication of a way in which certain decisions are made for people. You don't have to kind of worry about it, right? You put it in a certain in an investment, and it kind of looks after itself. And certainly Mark Carney, when he was governor of the Bank of England, got quite excited about the possibilities of this and the use of AI to help people make financial decisions, because various work in the past by people like David Knights and so on has illustrated that people don't like engaging with financial products because they find them difficult, anxiety-inducing in many cases about how to make those. Well, I as someone who's retired, I probably hesitate to mention this, but I'm going to think about pensions, for example. So the USS pension is a valued asset of the academic life in the UK, precisely because it was so it makes those kind of decisions for people, and it's that's something that people don't have to make. They don't have to become their own actuary. So I guess you could see lots of bad decisions that people might make collectively if you can kind of program that in to an app that's subject to a certain kind of regulation. Then that helps, right? So the danger is that's like you can see that has been a good thing if it kind of does, if it inculcates savings and inculcates people managing their finances better so they don't get into debt, and they're able to kind of compare different kinds of products and so on in a way that's easier. You could see that as a good thing. But I guess then the danger is the other side of that, with the kind of Brown and Porowski's argument as well. But that's it's not really doing that. It may encourage people to use different kinds of activity. So where's the line between you and these kinds and other kinds of apps where you're spending money, I guess?
Can I just add something there? I go back a decade or so, and kind of interviews I did at the FCA, and the degree to which they'd kind of had this sort of behavioral economics makeover in their approach to regulation. I remember being quite shocked by it at the time. And I think for a good portion of their regulation of FinTech, part of the reason that FinTech can be just right is this kind of assumption that, the interfaces and apps and so on can be designed in such a way as to inculcate the kinds of decisions that people would like to take for themselves if they had the knowledge, if they had the time, if they weren't so apathetic, and so on. Clearly, once you've got apps and interfaces that are precisely designed to shape and to guide behavior, that isn't necessarily always progressive and helpful, right? So one of the payday lending apps that I researched, I had a situation where basically to be part of when you took up the payday loan, the offer was that it would automatically top up your account with a new loan if your bank account got close to driving you into an overdraft that you weren't licensed to take out, right? You couldn't afford, and so it would automatically replenish your account with a payday loan if there was a danger of you becoming overdrawn. And this actually won awards, right, in the UK. This particular payday loan app won awards for its capacity to use AI to determine in advance whether you were likely to suffer overdraft charges. And so I think there's always that fine line between what counts as being good or progressive behavior shaped and framed by an interface or an app, and that which could be regarded to be dangerous and to the detriment of the user, right? But there's certainly a sense in which for UK regulator, that kind of, if you like, post rational financial man, and it was financial man perspective that they worked with on regulation for some time, that was driving kind of the promotion of financial literacy and so on, that they kind of moved away from that, moved to a behavioral economics model of the financial consumer, of the financial user. And that then has informed the kind of consumer side of the regulation of FinTech in the UK in a way that I think is, from my research anyway, would suggest that's kind of more pronounced in the UK than anywhere else in the world. I think there are regulators elsewhere in the world that are still, at least to some degree, working with the rational economic man financial literacy model of how to conduct consumer regulation. So maybe part of the just right story in the UK is precisely that adoption of behavioral economics, alongside the concerns that Andrew's talked around competition and so on. And I think that the kind of sort of, if you like, the domestic regulator in the UK seems to be facing one way and have one set of concerns around consumer and so on, whereas other regulators and other policymakers perhaps are looking internationally. So some of the Janus face here, right, with these regulations.
Many thanks, Paul. Do you want to respond to that, Derek? Or maybe Andy still wants to respond to this?
No, I was just looking at the chat. I just saw Chris's comments about USS, that they're certainly making decisions. Yeah, so I didn't necessarily say they were making great decisions in all areas, but historically, over the long term, that's what I meant.
Derek, any famous final words, or infamous, if you prefer?
Thank you very much. I just posted a question to everyone. When will financial regulation be shaped by financial geographers' research, or whether we want this to happen ever? But back to you, Manuel.
Okay, thanks, Derek. I guess there was a pun in there, but you were breaking up again. So maybe it's good that as my connection is getting worse and worse, that we have reached the end of the session. Andy, thanks a lot again. Paul, also thanks for chipping in here. I want to wish nice holidays to everyone. And next year we are likely to be back with another virtual series. We haven't planned anything yet, but after the success, as we self-define it, of the first 3 series, we think there is reason to do another series next year, possibly in a lower frequency, not with a lecture every 2 weeks, but maybe a little less. But you will hear from us. If you won't hear from us, it's possibly because you're not on our mailing list, and then you can go to fingeo.net and you can make sure you're on our mailing list, and then you won't miss the next announcement. Okay, thanks everyone, and enjoy the holidays.